بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. So we are on lesson 16 in our reading of Risalat al-Khushu' and we are going to be continuing our discussion on the integrals of prayer and the instructions and guidance that Imam al-Khadimi has to give in terms of what we should be focused on in these actions of prayer and how we can attain khushu' within them. And so in the previous lessons, we took the Fatiha, we took recitation in prayer, we took the ruku', and now we are going to be looking at this brief section on sujood or prostration. And so Imam al-Khadimi says, "As-sujudu wa huwa a'la darajat al-istikana," that it is the highest form of expressing compliance to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is something that we've mentioned in previous lessons. When we were discussing ruku', we mentioned that ruku' is like a mini sajda. And ruku' involves the humble lowering of the head in front of one's Lord. The sajda is a more emphatic form of this. In the sajda, you are taking the most honored part of your body, your face, and you are lowering it to the ground in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so it is really the highest form of expressing submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this was recognized by the ulama who really considered sajda to be the essence of the prayer. And fuqaha would show a recognition of this fact even in the legal rulings that they prescribed. So to take an example of this, when someone falls sick and he's unable to stand, the ulama mentioned that he is still required to perform prayer with bowing on and prostration. And it is only when he is completely unable to perform salah with a sajda that he can perform prayer with head movements. Similarly, the ulama also have, when you look at their fiqh rulings, they understand that the different integrals and actions of prayer express submission and reverence to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at different levels and to different degrees. And so the ulama will mention that if someone is unable to stand, if he is unable to do qiyam or perform it, then the next step is he should perform prayer with actual bowing on prostration. He can sit on the ground, but he still has to prostrate. But if someone is unable to prostrate, let's say you have some injury on your head, you're unable to prostrate, but you can stand up. The ulama in this case, many of them, at least in the Hanafi school, they say that in this case, standing is not an obligation upon you. And the reason for this is standing is actually seen by them, even though in itself there's an element of respect and reverence in standing in front of your Lord. The ulama mentioned that standing was also legislated as a means to enter into sajda in its most perfect form, in the most perfect of ways. And the most emphatic way in which you can enter into prostration is from a full standing position, going all the way down and placing your forehead on the ground. And so they were like, in order to make the sajda more expressive of reverence and compliance and submission, this is why the standing was legislated. And so when you're unable to perform the sajda, the obligation for standing also ceases to be. And over here we get the sense that the ulama understood that the sajda was stronger. As a rukn, it is stronger because it expresses the meaning of prayer at a higher level. And prayer is ultimately about submission. It expresses that in a greater way than simply the act of standing. And so when that ceases, when sajda ceases, then the obligation for qiyam ceases as well. And these are just interesting tidbits to keep in mind of how the idea of the way these integrals and actions of prayer, the way they express a particular meaning, how this is also reflected in the rulings of fiqh. Imam al-Khadimi then says, فمكن أعز أعضائك وهو الوجه من أظل الأشياء وهو التراب. وإن أمكنك أن لا تجعل هائلا بينه وبين الأرض فإنه أضل من الظل وأجلب للخضوع. So he says, basically describing the reality of what sajda is, that it is placing the most honored of your limbs, which is your face, on the lowest of things, which is the earth and dust. And if you are able to perform the sajda without placing anything between yourself and between this natural earth, then this is even more expressive of the state of lowliness, and it is more conducive to producing a sense of humility and humbleness towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this act of prostrating on natural earth, some of the ulama deemed it to be recommended for this very reason. And they said that it is superior to prostrate on natural earth than to have a prayer rug or anything that prevents the head from touching the the actual ground. Then Imam al-Khadimi says, فإذا وضعت نفسك موضعها الأصلية المخلوقة من التراب أولا ثم ترد إليه فجدد عظمته تعالى بقولك سبحان ربي الأعلى وأكده بتكرار فإن المرة الواحدة ضعيفة الأثر. So he says that when you go into this position of prostration and you are placing your head on an area that is basically from which you have been created, namely the earth and dust, and to which you will return, then at this point reaffirm the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by saying Subhana Rabbil A'la, and emphasize this by repeating it more than once. And we know the sunnah is to repeat it 3 times. And this is because the first instance, just saying it once, has a weak effect on an individual. And this is something that we recognize universally when it comes to all languages, that repetition has a particular effect of imprinting something and emphasizing something to the individual, and that effect is not found in simply saying it once. And so we find throughout the statements of the Prophet ﷺ that he would repeat things multiple times in order to really emphasize the point that he was making. And so similarly, when we are in sajda, the reason why it's been legislated that we say Subhana Rabbil A'la 3 times or 5 times or more is because we're really trying to bring our heart into that state of presence with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we are really trying to imprint that message that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the greatest of all beings, and he is the loftiest in terms of his being and his position and his status. فعند ذلك فلتصدق رجاءك في رحمة ربك فإنها تتسارع إلى الضعف وذل لا إلى التكبر والبطر. And so he says at this point, when you recite Subhan Rabbil A'la, and when you affirm it to yourself, then at this point affirm your hope in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his mercy is quick to come to those who are weak and those who are lowly and in need, as opposed to those who are arrogant and vain. And this is, of course, something that is what we find in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ and various Quranic verses. So in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, he describes himself as أَمَّنْ يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ. Right? He asks, who is it who answers the one who is really constricted when he calls out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so the ulama, what they mention is that there are effectively 2 main groups of people whose dua, whose supplication is not rejected by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whose dua is guaranteed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One is the individual who is oppressed, and one is the individual who is in that state of complete constriction and limitation, where he has no might, no power, he sees no way out, and all he can do is turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are the two types of individuals whose supplication is accepted. And so, and the reason for this is because these are really emphatic expressions of need. These are high forms of expressing need. When you are completely oppressed by someone, when you are completely constrained and cannot turn to anyone but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the fulfillment of your needs. And so this is what Imam al-Khadimi means by by his statement that the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is quick to come to those who are in this state of weakness. And when you are in sajda, what you are is you are in a state of weakness, because this act of placing your most honorable limb on the ground in submission and humility and reverence to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is an affirmation of your utter weakness, your lowliness, and your neediness towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so this is why the sajda is such a powerful act, because it is such a strong expression of this neediness and loneliness and weakness that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala listens to our du'as in those moments. And we are close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in those moments more than we may be in other actions, inside and outside of the prayer. And so the sajda needs to be taken, it needs to be understood for the reality that it represents. And it is only when we understand what the sajda represents in terms of what it expresses, what we are saying in it, how it relates to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy and our reception of that mercy, then we take that act of sajda more seriously. And so when we recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy is guaranteed for people who really express this intense level of neediness towards him, and then we recognize that sajda is that one action where that neediness and weakness